first question stands in the name of Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance and asks, what reports has he received on the total amount of dividend payments sent offshore to the Australian owners of ASB, ANZ National, Westpac and the BNZ over the last 5 years, and what is this amount?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, I haven't received any such reports, although the information the members after may be available through annual reports of the banks concerned, although he would need to ensure that dividends that were paid were all going to Australian owners. There may well be significant New Zealand investment in those banks listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. The RBNZ Financial Stability Report released last week finds that the overall banking sector profitability declined during the recession, but is now likely to improve as the economy improves.
Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can he confirm that according to the Reserve Bank figures to which he referred, in the 5 years to 2009, the overseas-owned banks drained around $9 billion out of New Zealand? And what was the impact on the New Zealand economy of this loss of capital?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, I'll take the member at his word about that amount, which I presume is the accumulated profits of the banks. I think one thing clearly we're anxious that if New Zealanders had saved more over the years, we may well have been the owners of all our banks. I'll just keep in mind, and over recent years, we've had the advantage through the recession of the Australian banks being now among the 10 safest banks in the world. So the fact that they have been profitable has been one factor that has helped us get through this recession without a banking collapse. And one has only to look at the effect of banking collapses on other economies to realise how fortunate we have been.
Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does he think that the Australian banks were acting in the best interests of New Zealand in 2008-2009 during the recession he referred to, at a time when New Zealand was short of capital, when those banks repatriated about 85% of their profits back to Australia and only retained 15% of their profits in New Zealand?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there could be a range of opinions about how banks deal with their profits, and myself and the member might share a concern about whether New Zealand's interests are paramount in the minds of the Australian shareholders. But through the 2008-2009, I think it'll be some time before we get the whole picture. The point to remember there is that the banks were unable to borrow in world wholesale funding markets, which essentially meant the pipeline of cash coming into New Zealand was closed off. And it does appear that the Australian parent banks did lend significant amounts of cash to the New Zealand banking system, probably in a way that probably enabled our banks to continue to provide mortgages and overdrafts to New Zealand households and businesses. So I'm a bit reluctant to criticise them for their most recent period of the last 2 years through the banking crisis.
Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister agree that if Kiwibank were sold to overseas owners, then any profits from Kiwibank would be added to this drain of capital from New Zealand, adding further to our current account deficit?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government's position on that issue is quite clear, that there'll be no sales of any assets this term of office, and if that was to change, then the terms of that would be announced to the electorate before the election, so there's plenty of opportunity to debate them and then National would campaign on them.
Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In light of his comments floating the possibility of a partial privatisation of Kiwibank, what mechanism does he propose to use to prevent New Zealand shareholders in a privatised or partially privatised Kiwibank from passing their shares onto overseas owners?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker. I couldn't answer that question directly because the government hasn't considered any of those issues at all.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does he agree with Kiwibank CEO Sam Knowles that the big Australian banks are, quote, comfortable, established incumbents with a focus on maximising profits rather than competing, and that Kiwibank introduces a much-needed element of competition in the banking sector, competition that might be lost if Kiwibank were privatised and sold to overseas owners?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, yes.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. If Kiwibank is sold to Australia, will the government require Kiwibank to change their theme song from God Defend New Zealand to Advance Australia Fair, or perhaps Advance Australian Profits?
The Honourable Bill English. Order. Order.
I find that question easier to answer if it wasn't asked with an Australian accent.
Question number... point of order, Dr Russell Norman.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order has been called.
Order!
I seek leave of the House to table a potential Kiwibank advert after this government privatises Kiwibank.
Order, leave us sought to table that document. Is there any objection? There is no objection. Question number 2, the Honourable Ruth Dyson.